Distinguished Faculty of Leadership and Performance at NLI, Christy Pruitt-Haynes. Thanks for being here today, Christy.
Absolutely. Thanks, Shelby.
You're welcome. And for our next guest, a long history of driving change and building culture in large, complex organizations has given her deep expertise around DEI practices and principles, especially in the area of communications. In fact, she broke barriers as one of the first, and for a long time only, Black C-level speechwriters in the Fortune 100. Her 3 TED presentations challenging businesses to get serious about inclusion have collectively over 2.5 million views. Her superpowers: applying neuroscience to solve DEI challenges, building actionable DEI frameworks, and brokering honest DEI conversations among top leaders. Please join me in welcoming NLI's Global Head of DE&I, Janet M. Stovall. Great to have you here, Janet, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Shelby.
Yes, and thank you for having both of us here. We are so excited about this conversation. I think it is both timely and needed. So we want to kick things off with a quote that hopefully you can all see, but William Hattie, excuse me if I can get my words out, American lawyer, judge, and civil rights advocate, gives us a different way to really look and think about history. Primarily, it's all about creating a better future. And so often that's not what we think of when we think of history, but that's one of the opportunities that we have. Given what NLI does, and then combining that with the current backlash that we all see against diversity, equity, and inclusion, along with the fact that February is Black History Month, we really viewed this through the lens of neuroscience and wanted to ask the question, what can it teach us about now? And what can it teach us about what's next? Turns out the answer is a lot. But unfortunately, we only have an hour, so we've narrowed it down to 3 things that we want to focus on during our time together. When we really think about the 3 things that Black history and neuroscience can teach us about diversity, equity, and inclusion today, we landed on the 3 of bias bars equity, historical trauma is real, and I would love to underline that real. It is very real. And we need to move the big rocks first. So when we think about that, let's jump in and really start with this wonderful conversation on bias barring equity. You know, for a lot of people, when we think about bias, we really think of discrimination, which in the workplace, most people assume was addressed through affirmative action. And in part, it was. So in other words, people assume bias and discrimination is a part of our history. So what can we learn when we really look at that history? And how does neuroscience help us examine it? Janet, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, there is some truth in the fact that bias can and it does lead to discrimination. And when we talk about the workplace, discrimination against Black people was precisely what affirmative action was supposed to fix. However, what we know now from neuroscience is that if you have a brain, you have bias, and laws can't fix that. Cognitive bias is unconscious. And when you drop cognitive bias into society with its history of systematic exclusion, you end up with implicit bias. And implicit bias can be unconscious, but it also can be conscious. Laws can address the conscious or the provable bias. They can minimize the tangible outcomes of bias, which are discrimination and exclusion. But the bias you can't see, the bias you can't prove, you can't legislate that away. So whereas affirmative action worked against systematic inequity, which is about the law, it couldn't undo the systemic inequity that's unseen, that's embedded, but is very real, that bias has created and sustained. And now here we have SCOTUS, which has started to dismantle even the few guardrails we had. So when we think about it systemically, affirmative action did what it could, but there's only so much it could do. And if we take that down into the more common level in the workplace, then I think let's talk about what that means. And Christy, given your talent and performance expertise, what do you think Black history has taught us about bias once we actually can manage to get into an organization?
Great question. Thank you. So, you know, many people believe that our workplace cultures are completely fair But more likely, if you're one of those who believes that, it just means you are unaware of the biases that exist. Maybe they aren't affecting you, or you just haven't really taken those blinders off to pay attention to them. So these biases can affect everything from hiring to the top executives to bringing in entry-level staff and what people do to get promoted, and even the systems that organizations have in place to drive those promotions. They also influence whose ideas are valued and whose concerns are taken seriously and how we design customer experiences. I remember going into a store with a friend of mine who was a different race, and the way I was treated versus the way she was treated were very different. So that customer experience was extremely different for us. And a lot of people would not have noticed it because we all pay attention to what our experience is, as opposed to thinking about how things are affecting others. It's an even bigger issue, though, when we think about leadership and leaders who have that outsized role within an organization. Love to share a few stats on this. So Black people are roughly 14% of the US population, but hold less than 6% of all executive roles within corporations. And when we think at the very top level, Black CEOs are less than 2% of all Fortune 500 CEOs. So bias also affects how leaders operate. Once we're in an organization, what's allowed and what isn't. When we think about similarity bias, which is one of the most common that we experience, leaders who favor other leaders or favor those who are similar to them, that can lead to those unfair resource distributions and really unfair task assignments. Again, we lean into the people that are most like ourselves. And when we experience that, it affects all of the decisions that we make, even when we aren't aware of it. And that unconscious bias also influences succession planning, and biased executives may lean towards candidates that most resemble them. Maybe they went to the same university, maybe they grew up in the same area, they all play golf together on the weekends. And that subconsciously really affects who we lean into and who we reach out to most. Unconscious bias can also affect who gets a job in the first place, and then how they're judged within that role and how they lead. We've seen so many stats on performance reviews and how people assess whether someone is being successful or not. So oftentimes women are judged more harshly, particularly when they have a man who's doing that judging. And that happens throughout every industry and every organization. Excuse me, so sorry. And this has a huge effect on all of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The fact that you can have, and I believe, Janet, actually, I was just thinking about this. I believe you're working on an article about that, aren't you? And I've also heard you say, and this is something that really resonated for me. It's one of the reasons I've been specifically saying diversity, equity, and inclusion instead of DEI. But I've heard you say that instead of saying DEI, we should actually say those words, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is that really important?
Well, I am working on an article, and saying diversity, equity, and inclusion is important. The article is going to talk about how leaders actually may be a big issue in the backlash on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We think about the fact that, the CEO and the people at the top, they always want to do this work and they're always going to push it, and the power comes from the top. But what we're seeing is that actually leaders have an outsized role. You said that earlier. Leaders have an outsized role in what happens in an organization. So it stands to reason that they'd have an outsized role in what happens with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Unfortunately, their biases may be playing a huge role in the backlash itself, even if they feel it, even if they say, we're getting this from customers, we're getting this from employees, but we don't want to do it. Their bias may have a role in that. And the article that I'm working on is going to use our SEEDS model of unconscious bias to examine exactly why leaders might be playing that role in this current backlash. And so be on the lookout for that. I'm working on it. I'll get to it. But then to address that question that you asked me about why I want to say diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, I wrote this LinkedIn post about it, and I had no idea that it would blow up the way it did. So what I realized from that is a lot of people are feeling the same way. But the reason I won't say DEI is because As I wrote in that post, if we don't spell out what we're doing, if we don't distinguish between diversity, equity, and inclusion, and if we don't say those words, we run the risk of underestimating the damage that's being done by those who are trying to dismantle it. And I'm not going to call names, but we all saw that post, DEI must die. I'll ask you this. If somebody had said, no, say it all the way out, say diversity must die, equity must die, inclusion must die, I dare say there would have been some different headlines behind that. We hide the importance when we use the acronyms. And so what we know too at NLI is the same thing about bias. Just saying you have bias and not labeling it, not saying what it is, not pointing to exactly what type of bias it is, it takes away the ability to mitigate it. Bias in general, you can't solve. Bias in particular, you can mitigate. And so we got to name it. We got to name it. We got to label it in order to mitigate the bias. And we have to name the work so that we can highlight each aspect and the role of each one of those aspects in building a stronger and more equitable organization. So when we talk about organizations then, Christy, I'll swing this back to you. What does history and the reality of bias tell us about the future of diversity and equity and inclusion?
I'm glad you asked. Great.
Go for
it. Yes, great question. Great question. Well, I think it really calls to action, or at least it should be, that we can't eliminate bias, but we can mitigate it, as you said. I think both of us would agree. I wish we had a magic wand to just wave and say, okay, all the bias is gone, everything is equal. But we know history won't allow us to do that. For decades, NLI has been helping organizations really do that at scale. And we've seen the power of that collective behavior change. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take each of us working together. This can't just be happening at the top of an organization. We really have to see all employees, all team members at every level really focusing on this and thinking about how important it is and taking action to move in that direction.
And we've actually, and to follow up on that, there's actually a quote out there, I think Margaret Mead,
yes.
And she said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. And in fact, it's the only thing that ever has. For me to say that, a lot of people would say, well, that sounds particularly optimistic and sunny for you. And it probably does. But, I truly believe that. And I said that in my TED Talk when I said that I believe business can dismantle racism. And history has shown us that it's really one of the only places, one of the only entities that has ever really tried. And despite the fact that it looks a little, stormy now, the truth of the matter is business is the only entity that has the power, the ability, the resources, and increasingly the motivation to actually change this. So I believe that business can do this. And I think that if we have to focus on it in this world to do it. That's what history has taught us, that business can change this.
I agree. And I'm so glad you said about the motivation, because that is such an important piece of this. There has to be a reason, and the reason has to go beyond just the kind of touchy-feely, feel good. And this is something you and I have talked about before. Those kumbaya moments are important, but that's not what's going to really move us ahead. And in thinking about this from really a historical perspective, a lot of this is all around the historical traumas that have happened. And we've seen them show up both in personal lives and professional lives. But that trauma really affects so much of how we engage and so much of how we think about DEI. So I know you've heard this, that if Black people could just leave the past in the past and apply all of that energy to changing the future. Do you think that's true? Is it possible to just leave the past in the past and really just apply that energy to changing and dealing with the here and now? What are your thoughts?
Okay, no. And don't you just hate that word just? If we could
Yes.
just do this, then we could just do that. I mean, honestly, if we could just leave it in the past, wouldn't we? I would. I don't want to deal with this every day. But
I'm sick of talking about it. So yeah, I agree.
I'd love to talk about something different. The problem is We can't. I think it was Faulkner who said the past is never dead. It's not even past. So we can't just forget about it because that trauma, that past trauma, is our current trauma. It's still with us. And we know that. I mean, we have documented disparities that Black people live with, the economic gaps, the professional things that don't happen, educational gaps. There are also, though, some physical and cognitive effects that we are slowly beginning to recognize. I think it was Dr. Arlene T. Geronimus. She coined this term called weathering. And weathering is a description. It describes the effects of systemic oppression, racism and classism on the actual body. And there's data that support this. Public health shows that Black people suffer more from chronic disease and premature death. For Black women living with a double weight of racism and sexism, it's even worse. We see the stats. Black mothers are 3 times more likely to die during childbirth. And one that we may not be aware of, for example, is that Black women get uterine fibroids significantly more than women of other races. 25% of Black women aged 18 to 30 have them. The norm is only 6%. And by their late 40s, 70 to 80% of Black women may develop these tumors. I know this personally. Among my family and friends, not having fibroid tumors is the exception rather than the rule. You probably know that too. And so, bottom line, historical trauma can affect physical health. And that is not about lifestyle. It's not about degrees of education. There's studies that show that Black women have more maternal morbidity and mortality, even if they have PhDs, than white women do in society. So it is not about lifestyle decisions. It's not about education. And there's an evolving science called epigenetics that suggests that historical trauma can actually change our DNA. So what we're starting to understand is that cognitive health is also affected by these centuries of racism against Black people, especially women. Historical trauma is real. It can severely impact the brain. It can take months, years, decades to recover from those effects. And there's a study, in fact, right now at Emory Brain Health Center that found that Black women who faced more racial discrimination had stronger brain responses related to detecting and managing threats. And if there's one thing we know at NLI, it's about threats. Our SCARF model, which has been around for a while, which has recently been redone, consistently shows that when we feel threatened, we simply do not and cannot function at our highest levels. And so the reality is that employees of color, Black employees in particular, and Black women even more so, are struggling. We see it. We've seen suicide. Christy, you talked about how these things affect you personally. I have 2 very dear friends who are close in age or younger than me who are waiting for heart transplants right now. It was a shock to me. 2 in my circle. And I don't think that's a coincidence. So the question is, what can organizations actually do? And how can they do something without alienating their other employees?
I'm glad you brought that up. And I would love to just for a moment go back to some of those health effects, and then we'll move ahead. And I took the slides down. There was a request, I don't know if you saw it, Janet, that they wanted to see our faces more. So
here we are.
here are our lovely smiling faces. But you know what's interesting is we all know none of us can do our best work when we don't feel well. None of us can do our best work when we are struggling with health issues. So that's another reason and another motivation, I think, for organizations to really do all they can to mitigate the effects of these bias. Because as Janet just pointed out, there are true health consequences. And if I am not feeling well, if I'm dealing with fibroids, if I'm dealing with heart issues, if I'm dealing with all of the physical manifestations of stress, there's no way I'm going to show up and do anything, effective in the workplace.
And it's not just about me, it's about what the company gets from me. It doesn't
Exactly.
yes, it's a right thing to do that I should feel better, but I can't contribute. I'm not earning my salary if I don't feel well. And so it's in everybody's best interest to address this.
Absolutely. And the amount of burnout that we've seen across all employees, but in particular across employees of color and women of color, and I will get even more specific and just say Black women specifically, the amount of burnout that we're experiencing and the way that that affects our ability to show up at work, the way that affects even our ability to show up in our personal lives is so huge and so tremendous that, as you said, organizations really have a true reason and a true motivation to focus on this. And the truth is that racial trauma, it is very real. But as we've talked about some already, that gender-related trauma is just as real. So when we combine the two, when we look at the intersectionality of a Black woman, it really doubles the effect that we're experiencing in the workplace. And I did a TED Talk years ago about women in the workplace and ways that we can really succeed. And one of the things I talk about in that is it takes everyone sometimes rallying around us and acknowledging the realities that we're experiencing. And until everybody acknowledges those realities, it's next to impossible for us to overcome them. So one of the ways that organizations can really acknowledge what is happening and the way that it's affecting not only everyone in the workplace, but as we mentioned, Black women specifically, is for organizations to really prioritize psychological safety. One of the reasons we see so much stress, we see so much trauma affecting us is we don't necessarily feel that level of psychological safety to speak up about the issues that we're having. So when we look at some of those things like it affecting who's hired, it affecting how people are promoted or evaluated, it takes a level of psych safety to raise our hand and say, this is what's happening, this is what we're experiencing, that sort of thing. So when we think about psychological safety, it's all about having the ability to ask questions, having the ability to push back on some of those decisions that we feel we need to push back on, that ultimately will benefit everyone in the workplace. But when we think about psych safety, not only does it benefit everyone, but we have to start with those who are most affected. We have to start with those who are most marginalized, which really brings us to the third fact we want to talk about just a little bit. Before we do that, Janet, anything else you want to say about psych safety before we move ahead?
Yeah, it's a term that has become very prevalent in the workplace. And, at NLI, we did a lot of work with the person who's essentially, we consider the godmother of psych safety,
Yes.
Amy Edmonds. And I had the pleasure of meeting her in person when we had our annual summit meeting. And one of the things I said to her was, I said, one of the pushbacks I've heard when we talk about psych safety, especially when we talk about sort of that intersectionality, is it's relative, because what makes one person feel psychologically safe in a space is not going to be what makes somebody else feel psychologically safe, because we come to it differently. And she and I had to talk about that. And one of the things she said was, yeah, it's actually relative and it's actually situational, because I can feel psychologically safe today in this team and not feel psychologically safe in another team. It really depends on that, on who's in that team. And what I came from that was, it really depends on who's leading those teams. So if anybody, back to that leadership issue again, if anybody can help make a team feel psychologically safe, it's going to be the leaders. And I think we have to be aware of the fact that psychological safety in an organization and in a culture is built one team at a time.
Yes.
Because I think you've also heard me, kind of give my side eye to the term belonging. I'm a firm believer that the reason I push back a little bit on that term is because I believe that belonging is experienced, or organizations try to talk about belonging in one of two ways. They either talk about creating a space of belonging or giving people a sense of belonging. You can't do either, because if you're going to create a space of belonging, what you're saying is you're going to create this general space, this universal space that everybody can feel a sense of belonging to. The problem with that is that if you're not co-creating that space with the people who are different, the people who are most marginalized, we just talked about the difference there. If you're not co-creating that space, if somebody has decided what that space looks like, there's no way that everybody can feel like they belong to it. If you say we're trying to give people a sense of belonging, then you've put the onus of inclusion on the person that feels excluded. You cannot do that. But what you can do is you can intentionally include. You can, within individual teams, intentionally, especially by leaders, try to create psychological safety. Part of that is you have to define what that means. Because what makes me psychologically safe is not going to make somebody who's not a Black woman psychologically safe. So
Mhm.
as a leader, your job, I think, is to define what does psychological safety look like in this team today on this project, and then team by team, organizations can build a culture, not of belonging, but a culture in which people have the opportunity to feel a sense of belonging, because you can't give it to them, but you can create the opportunity for it. And to me, that's why that's important to me, is because I like things that are actionable. I'm all for aspiration, but I want you to do something. I want you to tell me how to fix it. And inclusion depends on the organization, because what inclusion looks like at one place is not what it looks like someplace else. What psych safety looks like on one team is not what it looks like on another. And the only people who can help define that are the people who lead. So when you talk about psych safety, to me, I think that's within our control to create. And so that's why I believe it's important.
I'm so glad you brought up, there are a couple of points I want to kind of double down on if I can. First, that co-creation piece. And you're so right. You can't have this sense of belonging in a system that's only been created by and for a very specific group. At most, I may feel welcomed, but I'm still going to feel like a guest. So if I really want to have this sense of, belonging, and I completely agree with your thoughts on that, I need a hand in creating what that is, what that looks like, and how it affects me. And when we think about the stats we shared earlier about the disparity in who's sitting at the top of organizations, there is not equal co-creation, because at those CEO levels, everybody looks the same for the most part. Everybody is likely, kind of operating in that same space. So it makes it much harder to think about co-creation. So when we think about even the demographics of organizations, we want to have that diversity going across every level, across every department. You have some organizations that may have, look like on paper they have a lot of diversity when you look at their stats, but then it's all sitting at the lower level of the organization. It's not, they're not moving up. We aren't being promoted into those other positions. So it still doesn't have that same sense that so many people assume or think that would be there. And then another thing that you mentioned about psych safety that really stood out for me is one person can feel it. That doesn't mean it exists for everybody.
Exactly.
Psych safety is unfortunately not a universal thing that you can say, oh, we automatically feel safe. I know I can speak up, so why don't you? Why don't you have that same sense? And, it's for a lot of the reasons that we talked about earlier. The way we respond from one person to another are going to be different. And the ways someone responds to an individual in the organization affects whether or not they feel safe speaking up in the future. If I say something and your response is, oh, Christy's being overly emotional, you know how Black women can be sometimes.
Angry.
Not so subtle message to lean back and not say anything else to you. So just because someone else is feeling that level of psych safety, we can't assume it exists universally across the organization. And that's one of the things we talked about earlier with biases. Some people just don't see them. That's because it's not affecting them. We have to sometimes remove the idea of just looking at things through our own lens and look at it through, how is this affecting everybody? Not just how it affects me, but what's happening for everybody else here. And unfortunately, we don't always see that.
It's interesting. I did a keynote for one of our clients who's in the ESG space. And in doing the research for that, I pulled up this report, and it said something about it did a survey of leaders in the ESG space. And it said, which demographic feels like they belong? Surprise, surprise. The only demographic that felt like they belonged were white cisgendered men. Everybody else there was a huge disparity about who felt like they belonged. And, when you see those numbers, when people actually say it, I mean, they didn't ask them, they just took it and they cut the data, because I'm also a big believer in disaggregating data, because if you want to help the people who are most marginalized, you have to disaggregate the data so you can figure out who that is. And it's back to psych safety and anything else. If you don't disaggregate the data, you can't determine what people need. We talk about equity, because we love to use that term, people of color. We love the term BIPOC. That's another one of those terms I've decided in 2024 I'm not going to use anymore, because I first of all, I don't even know what it means. I don't know what BIPOC means. Is it, what does bi mean? If is it, is it Black, Indigenous, people of color? Well, people of color are Black. Are Indigenous people? I don't like the terms, but the reality, to get back to that, it is really a situation of we can't provide psych safety. We cannot look at inclusion if we don't really think about the fact that people are different.
Yes.
We say we want diversity, and we bring diversity into organizations. Then we say, okay, now you're here, act like everybody else. We say we want diversity, but then we build organizations for assimilation. And
Yes.
not only does that mess with, our psych safety, and it brings up all the historical trauma, it also limits what the organization can do. Because what is the benefit of diversity if you don't leverage it? What is the
Mhm.
benefit of people having different perspectives if you want everybody to think alike and you only reward assimilation? So
Yes.
I really think when we talk about psych safety, which is what we want to talk about, a lot now, we have to think about what that means individually. And that means we have to back into all these things like historical trauma. What
Mhm.
does that do? What does that historical trauma that maybe I don't even know that is affecting me? Because I don't even know it. I mean, I'm just there. What does that mean when I come into an organization and I'm trying to contribute and I'm trying to leverage a diversity? What is the ability? How does that disable me to do that? How does that limit my ability to do that?
Yes. And what that really brings up for me, I'm so glad you said that. Another phrase that I am banning and dropping for 2024 is culture fit.
Oh yeah.
Because what culture fit sort of subtly says to people is, yes, we want you to come into our organization, but then we want you to act just like everybody else here. Which kind of goes back to what you were saying, in that we're fine with you coming in with your diversity, but then once you get here, maybe you can kind of take that down a bit and
Bring it down.
think like us, act like us, etc. I've said that many times. The goal is not to think and act alike, it's to think and act together. And there's a big difference. The goal isn't to come into an organization to have all of us act and think and behave. It's for us to be able to partner and work together and embrace those differences, embrace that innovation that those differences are going to bring, and the creativity and the different perspectives and that sort of thing. That's when organizations can really capitalize on diversity. But again, it takes that first idea of welcoming all of those differences in, as opposed to having the goal of, we want everyone to be a culture fit, so we all act alike and talk alike and think alike and dress alike, etc. That's when we miss out on the benefits that otherwise would be there. And it is such an unfortunate thing, but that's one of those things that systemically has happened in organizations so often. You may bring people in, but then we want everybody to be the exact same thing. And it just misses the boat for me.
I like culture add better.
Yes, that's the phrase that I use. Culture add. Bring in your different perspectives, add to what is already here, because that's the goal of diversity, right?
Mhm.
For everyone to add their perspectives and it sort of be layered on, and we learn from each other. Because in my opinion, that's when we broaden the collective knowledge that the organization has to draw from. When we know, we bring in what you know and what I know and what David knows and what everyone else knows. That's when we then have this sort of 360 approach of everybody's knowledge, as opposed to just deepening what one person believes. So it's so important. I'm with you. Culture add is my 2024 phrase.
We got to do a whole new dictionary of what we're not going to say anymore. We have to have a whole list of that. We got to do a whole y'all on that. You're pretty
Yes,
loud on that one.
I
What we not
agree. I
what we're
agree.
not saying in 2024.
I'm starting to list now. And before we move on to talk about some of those systemic things and those big rocks, we have a question I'd love to take a look at. Someone asked, do you have any suggestions for nonprofits who have addressed diversity and inclusion in dialogue with employers, but then no further action or suggestions have been taken? So how can you move forward? And I think this is something we see in a lot of organizations. They talk about it, maybe they give training on it, but then nothing happens after that. There's no follow-up and there's no real behavior change. So any thoughts there on how they can proceed? And I know that's a big question. So
no, it is a big question, but that's okay. And the question was, what, nonprofits specifically?
Yes, they asked specifically about nonprofits.
That's interesting. I work with one of the people that is closest to me in life and sort of professionally works in the nonprofit space. And she and I talk about this a lot. Nonprofits are interesting because their leadership is predominantly not representative of the demographics that a lot of nonprofits work for. So there's a
Yes.
real disconnect there. And that probably has a lot to do with why you talk about it, but nothing really changes because the
Mhm.
people in charge don't, like you said earlier, don't really have a sense of what's wrong. And so often, the best meaning folks want to do the right thing. And we know that, especially in nonprofit world, that's what you exist for, to do the right thing. You want to do the right thing and you stop there. You're like, or you believe that because I'm doing this work, because I'm in this space, of course I'm doing the right thing. Of course I'm making things better. It doesn't lend itself then to really looking at solutions to change things. But the same issues that we have in the for-profit world, where we talk about this, we don't do anything, I think they're exacerbated in the nonprofit world because they really think they are doing something. And so the question is, what do you do about it? Well, I am a firm believer in the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it gets a bad rap. There are people who will
Mhm.
push back and say, but the moral case is more important. And like I said, I think that's definitely going to be the issue in the nonprofit world because they're
Yeah.
all about the moral case. And I've had people who have said to me, especially when you talk about Black people in this space, we talk about it can be almost exploitation. At Summit, I did a talk with at one of our panels. One of the professors, who's a professor at Stanford, Jordan Stark, he's a professor at Stanford. He and I fought tooth and nail before this. I thought we are not going to be able to get on the stage because we cannot agree with each other on this one. But
Mhm.
we finally actually found a place where we could agree. And what we figured out was this: it is the culture. You do have to make the culture better. You do have to do it for the right reasons. But whether it is in the nonprofit world or whether it is a for-profit world, at the end of the day, organizations exist to do something. In the for-profit world, it's about solve for either making money or saving money. It's about the bottom line. In the nonprofit world, there's a mission. At the end of the day, that's your business case. And
Yes.
you start with the business case. If you start with what it is you are there to do, if you start with what is diversity solving for here, you can then sort of reverse engineer how you're going to do it. If your goal is we're solving to do the right thing, we're solving to make everybody feel a sense of belonging, it's not real easy to come up with a game plan for that. How do you know it when you do it? How do you measure it? What are you looking for? What does success look like? If, however, you identify a tangible goal, whatever it is, which means you objectify your goal, which means you come up with what the business case is, you put numbers around it, you can then reverse engineer your way into that. And you
Mhm.
can build policies and procedures, and you can build ways to measure whether or not you get there. And like I said, for the nonprofit world, it's a little bit harder because you come into that thinking that our goal is something that is the right thing to do, the moral case. There's a business case for you too, because at the end of the
Yes.
day, I had this discussion with my daughter who works for a college. And I said, I have a hard time explaining this. She goes, look, I work in development for college. Our job is to get money in here. That's what we
Mhm.
have to do. We have a bottom line too. And most nonprofits have some sort of a bottom line. So if we start there, and if we start thinking about the value of diversity within any organization and listen to the people who you brought in because you want their ability, you'll find out the real tangible things you can do. And once you identify the real tangible goals, it is a lot easier to identify the non-tangible, the diversity, equity, and inclusion goals that will help you achieve those tangible goals.
Absolutely. And I love that you said listen to the people that you brought in, because that reminds us that first you have to bring in the right people.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you mentioned that is so true about nonprofits is so often who works there and who they are serving look, act, and live very different lives. So what
Exactly.
ends up happening is a lot of assumptions are made. Those nonprofits sometimes can make some assumptions on what to do, how to do it, and what this group really needs without actually engaging that group to ask them. So it's
Mhm.
one of the reasons. And whether it's a nonprofit or for profit, it really reminds us that we need to listen to our customers. We need to know what they're experiencing and what they're living. And one of the best ways to do that is to have them be a part of our organization,
Just
have them
ask.
within those four walls.
Just ask the people you get there, because you really run the risk of the savior complex. The savior
Yes.
complex does not help us no matter where we are. So I'm like, just ask. You got Black people there, just ask a Black person.
Yes.
Yes. And I know that there's a discussion that we don't want to have the burden of educating everybody. So yeah, there's that. You have to balance that. But at the end of the day, if you've gone through the trouble to bring people in for their diversity, and then you stop there, we got you here. You got bodies in the building. If you don't figure out how to bring the brains into the business or the brains into the organization, having the bodies in the building doesn't help you.
Absolutely, spot on. And what that really, to go back to, I think we had a wonderful tangent. So to go back to what we were saying earlier, one of the things this reminds us of is we have to move those big rocks first. And what that really means is we have to think about some of the systems that are in place. We have to think about the things that we can control and really focus on that. And I've heard you talk a lot about moving those big rocks first when it comes to DEI. So can you tell us a bit more about what you really mean by that, what that looks like, and how each of us can do it?
I think when I say move the big rocks first, it really means two things to me. Number one, it harkens back to what you said earlier about starting with the most marginalized. In many parts of the world, the big rock is gender, or it can be orientation, or it can be religion. But in the United States, the big rock is race. We know it. We don't like to say it, but we know that. And if we don't think we know it, think about what SCOTUS aimed for first when they started tearing down guardrails: race. When we think about what the people who are pushing back against diversity, equity, and inclusion, the DEI trolls and the detractors are going in on, what are they going in on hardest? Race. And while race may be just a social construct, its intangible existence has some really tangible effects. So that is the issue that we got to focus the lion's share of our efforts on. And history has shown us that that's not just the right thing to do, that there's real value in doing it. I mean, because think about the civil rights movement. It became the wellspring of all the great movements of social justice and equality in the United States. It pioneered many of the organizational forms and political strategies that were important to the gay, the women's, and the Latino rights movements, among others. When we moved that big rock first, we cleared the space for everyone else. The second thing that I think about when I say move the big rocks first is to focus on the systems. You just said that. Focus on the systems, not just the individuals. Racism is personal, and it involves a lot of bad actors. It always has, it always will. But you just cannot change some people. And as we said before, even the best of us who don't consider ourselves racist, we are dealing with bias. So what we have to focus on writ large is systems. That's what affirmative action did. That's what it worked. It went for the systems. And so if we think about bringing that into the workplace, Christy, I'll pose that back to you. What is important? What is the real importance of system change in the workplace?
First of all, it's everything. It is to me one of the biggest opportunities that every organization has, because so many of our systems are the things that reinforce behaviors. And what I really mean by that is an organization can say diversity is important, but if there isn't a system that then rewards or reinforces people who value diversity, then they're going to easily step away from it. And things like, and we talked about it some earlier, hiring practices, how we promote people, how we compensate people, all of those are major systems within organizations. So let's look at each of them, a little closer. When we think about compensation, we've all heard about the wage gap, whether it exists across gender, across race, across so many different demographics. There are easy things that organizations can do to help mitigate against those wage gaps that are part of their compensation system. One of the easiest things that a company can do is stop asking employees what their previous salaries were and then using that to base their current salary. The reason that matters so much if part of your compensation system is to base somebody's compensation on what they made at their last job, that goes into it with the assumption that they were compensated fairly at their last job. And if they weren't, all you're doing is continuing this gap that has existed likely for that individual's entire career. And the reality is, if I come into a job and a white man comes in to do the exact same job, you're going to expect the same thing from us. So we should be comped the same. So instead of basing our compensation on what we made previously, base it on the job itself. What is this job worth to the organization? So when we talk about systems, that's an easy thing that companies can do to really start providing that equity that we are all looking for, that equity that is going to really say, as an organization, this matters to us. And not just say, but demonstrate, because it's easy to say it, but ultimately we want the organization to demonstrate it.
That is so, I just love to hear you say that, because I think we can all relate to that.
Yes.
Especially, especially if we are in an underrepresented group. Don't ask me what I earned before, because it probably wasn't fair. I mean, the reality is that we know the system is not fair. So to then say we're going to lean into the system when it's convenient, we know it's not fair, but you know what? If I can pay you less, I'm going to lean into the system. To your point, it just exacerbates and it extends and it increases. It expands and it just doubles down on the inequity that exists. It just makes it worse. And so I'm really glad you used that example, because I think that's one that a lot of us can look at and have experienced.
Yes, yes. And that's just one of the systems that exist. Other things that are out there are systems around hiring. I just had a conversation earlier today with someone who is looking to transition into another position at a different organization. And what she keeps running into is people are being hired based on who they know, not what they know. And we've all seen that. And that is another system. If you truly, as an organization, say, we want to bring in the best person, then take away just hiring people based on their network. Really focus on, lean into, ask those questions that are going to demonstrate somebody's abilities as opposed to just someone's network. So those systems, again, represent such an opportunity to really prioritize that equity, to really lean into what companies are saying matter. It's a way to demonstrate it, and focusing on that really creates an environment where companies can truly move the needle and succeed with all of their talent, not just with certain members, not just with certain groups, but truly capitalize on the value that diversity, equity, and inclusion are designed and could potentially bring into your company.
Look at you not saying DEI. I love it.
Yes. We have a number of questions. I would love to take some time maybe to get to some of our questions, and because the truth is I could go on and talk about all of those systems for hours and hours, because that to me is the core of what HR has an opportunity to do, and that's where my background is. But I'm going to resist the urge to stay on that tangent and take a look at some of the questions. One is someone asked, can you elaborate on building a moral case? I know you spoke earlier, Janet, about the difference between a business case and a moral case, but they're wondering, I guess, a bit more on the moral case and what that it really is, and how it may add some value if it does.
It does provide value. I mean, it's when we talk about the moral case, we talk about sort of that general sense of we do diversity, equity, inclusion because it's the right thing to do. And the reality is this, even though I'm a firm believer that the business case is what gets funded and what gets done, because it affects the bottom line, the reality is you have to have both, because you are never going to achieve the business case if you have not done some work on the moral case, which is about making the culture someplace everybody wants to be a part of. Those things are inexorably linked. And so when I say focus on the business case, I always say you have to really, really tell this story the way it needs to be told to whoever needs to hear it. My background is communications. So I have learned very much that I need to translate the message so that you can hear me, because you don't necessarily hear it the way I hear it. So if I'm talking to a CEO who's bored and whose stakeholders, I'm going to be looking at him or her and saying, where's the money? What is this? What are you spending money on? If the only thing I have to justify the money I spend on diversity, equity, inclusion, and we're doing it because it's the right thing to do, I'm going to need to have something else. And that's where we've lost it. We who do this work have not learned to make that argument. But the moral case is the one that within the organization, employees need to hear. They need to understand that you are doing this because you want to build an inclusive culture. That is a moral case. We do it because it is the right thing to do, because people should be able to come to work and bring, I'm not going to say their authentic selves, because if I brought my authentic self to work every day, I'd be fired. But we bring the authenticity that we need to get the job done in the space. We bring the authenticity that is leverageable within the space. We bring that person that we are able to use that diversity. If you don't build a culture where that can be leveraged, where people can speak up, people can contribute, that's the moral case. That is where you build it from. And even then, I'm asking you to build it in an objective way. I'm saying let's move away from the it's the right thing to do. Because first of all, not everybody thinks it's the right thing to do. I don't want to depend on people thought slavery was the right thing to do for a while. I really don't want to depend on people thinking what the right thing to do is. So
Yes.
the right thing to do is the thing that makes the culture able to deliver on what the company is there to do. And if you can identify those things, then you can make the moral case is we need to make it so that people can do what needs to happen here. That's how you make the moral case, I think.
I love that. And you were spot on. And the truth is, and I think just to double down on what you said around communication, there are some people who are going to be driven by the business case. There are some people who are going to be driven by the moral case. So it's important to capture both, because ultimately you have to communicate the need in a way that that individual and each individual can hear it. So knowing different people are going to be driven by different things, we have to keep that in mind.
It's all about making it relevant to everybody, because
Yes.
one of the reasons this pushback is happening is that there are whole groups of people who feel like they've been left out of this discussion, primarily white men. That's who's pushing back. That's who they feel like they've been left out. We have not been able to make the case to them. And if we settle with it's the right thing to do, even if, because the thing is this, we still have not gotten past the idea of the zero-sum mentality, that
Yeah.
if you get something, I'm going to lose
You're
something.
taking it from me.
Right. We're not going to win that fight. So then if we're not going to win that fight, and if we keep trying to fight that fight, maybe a different way, like, how's that working out for us? Not well, let's try something different. Maybe what we need to do is sit back and say, okay, so what is it that you do care about? And can I frame this discussion in a way that you care about it? And I think we can, but that's going to require those of us who do this work and those of us who care about it to think about it differently. And to your point, you've got to make it matter, because at the end of the day, I don't care why people do it. I just want them to do it. And if I have to help you understand why it's important to you, I'll do that. I will give you, because the thing is, I do believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion is important on so many different levels. We just have to learn how to talk about it the right way.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask one question, and I'm going to preface this with, this is a question that we could probably talk about for an hour, and we've only got like 2 minutes left to do it.
Okay, so don't do it.
Throw it out, and we're going to try to keep our answer as brief as possible. But someone asked, how much of this is driven by fear from those who may possess or process how they assess a coworker as a threat? For example, I know that if you succeed, or if you are heard or seen, that I lose because I can't compete. I can't do what you do. I can't develop the relationships like you do. I'm not as dynamic as you, etc. So basically what they're asking is, how much of this is driven and supported by people who are afraid that if everyone is seen, it makes them look worse. And that really goes back to that, what you just said around that zero-sum game. So what are your thoughts? I have definite thoughts on this, but what are your thoughts on how much of this is rooted in fear? And because of that, how do we then overcome it?
All of it's rooted in fear. Because here's the thing. Everybody, I hate the term diverse people. That's a redundancy. All of us have some aspect of diversity, whether it's seen or unseen. So the idea is we want to be able, we shouldn't be afraid that somebody else's sense of diversity is being leveraged in a different way, but we are, because some of us think that we don't have it. We don't understand that if we focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're helping everybody. It is that zero-sum mentality. I think the only way you can do that is as an organization, as a team, as individuals, to really embrace the value of diversity. Because if you can value somebody else's diversity, if you can value your own, then you're not as afraid when somebody is using what they're good at to get the goal. We have something in NLI we call the superordinate goal, which is the thing that is bigger than any one of us as an individual that we're all working for. If organizations can identify what that superordinate goal is and then figure out how everybody contributes to it, you can get over some of that stuff of feeling like somebody else is taking something away from you because you're all working for the same thing.
Exactly. And just to quickly add to that, I think the two things we can do are constantly remind everyone that we are all working towards the same goal, which means we have to establish that goal up front. It's something we talk about at NLI all the time. Having everybody know what the goal is so we know we all are working towards it can help with that. And the other thing is acknowledging, as Janet just said, we all have something about us that can make us feel excluded at different times. Lean into that, recognize that everybody has some aspect of diversity and everybody has something in common with everyone else. Look for those commonalities. Let that sort of be the basis for collaboration whenever possible. Again, I know we could go on and on talking about this for hours, but we are close to time. I am going to transition and throw this to Evan so he can close us out for today. But Janet, I have absolutely loved this time with you. Thank you so much for having me here with you.
No, thank you.
Evan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Christy and Janet. What a wonderful session and what a wonderful way to celebrate as we cap off Black History Month. We have a few more days left, however, so the celebration isn't quite over, and we really appreciate all that you shared today. Wonderful conversation. Folks, as we head out today, I just want to share a couple of important announcements, one of which is that we will be back here, same time, same place next week. We will be sharing an updated point of view on diversity, equity, and inclusion, so looking forward to sharing that with you. I also have posted a number of super helpful links in the chat. Some things for you to know. The first link will direct you to a place where you can share your feedback on today's session as well as any requests that you have. We do have a poll up as well where you can do that. We have launched our new leadership development program, LEAD, the Neuroscience of Effective Management, and our second cohort is now taking registrations. That cohort begins on April 18th. You can visit the site neuroleadership.com/lead to learn more and get registered today. We have so many exciting events coming up in the near future, including a number of leadership development mini summits, executive dinners, and so much more. You can find all of our events listed under our events. You'll see the link, but in case you are unable to see that link right now, it is neuroleadership.com/our-events. If you loved today's episode, you're going to love our podcast. Listen to it anywhere you stream podcasts, or you can visit our site conveniently at neuroleadership.com/podcast. And finally, as we say goodbye, I just want to invite you to join our community and dig a little bit deeper with us. We have our Neuroleadership Insider program. We will be having an insider session early next week, so please go ahead and submit your applications. We will be reviewing those, and upon approval, we'll be inviting you to our next Neuroleadership Insider event. With all of that said, I thank you all for choosing to spend this time with us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks. Take care.